Going to start the recording, so if you can go ahead now.
Okay, thanks. Well, thank you, Christy, and hello again, everybody. For those who don't know me, my name's Dave Shepard. I've been a master naturalist with this program for about 2.5 years. The volunteer work I do is usually up at the Iroquois National Wildlife Refuge. Now, they work under fish and wildlife. And one of the things I want to talk about tonight is one of the big surveys that they have to do as part of their management efforts, and that is the forest inventory, where they take stock of their forest habitats and try to assess how it's doing and where it's going. And I can't advance my screen for some reason. There we go. Okay, a quick word on the refuges before we really get into this. There are over 600 of them nationwide, and they were originally conceived to conserve waterfowl. And the way we would do that would be to acquire the habitats that the waterfowl use. So you'll see these things scattered along the flyways. But when we preserve the wetland habitats, we're going to, of necessity, manage a lot of the other habitats that go with it. As you can see from the schematic of Iroquois here, and this is typical of the refuges here, you've got a lot of habitats all kind of mangled together a little bit. You can see the open water emergent marsh, you'd expect that, but we have a lot of forest, a lot of grassland, a lot of shrub as well. Now, most of this is wet in one form or another, so there's going to be standing water during some part of the year. We did our survey in late June of 2019. That was an extremely wet year here, and in some of the plots we were in standing water.
Upstairs to do something. Wait a minute, you're not supposed to hear that. It's okay, I'm going to do something.
Okay. Now, when the refuge staffs try to manage these properties, they have to do it in such a way that is rather intensive. They have to try to work all of them into their management program. And they have to do it in such a way as to try to mimic the natural cycles that would ordinarily go on there as closely as possible. So you're really concerned more with the ability of the ecosystem to support and maintain its community of plants and animals in a way that it would do for the region as a whole. It can be an intensive process because when you look at this is fairly good size as refuges go. This is 11,000 acres. And we've got state land on either side of us. But when you pull back and look at Western New York, this is a postage stamp. So you've got all that farmland all around it. You've got the urban areas of Rochester to the north, Buffalo to the west. And it's done a lot of changes to how the ecosystem will normally work. So what we're trying to do here is restore the natural rhythms. Now, all this management doesn't happen in a vacuum. You guys have all done work in the field, so you know that there's a lot of data taking when you try to manage something. And that data can be time intensive and labor intensive. Now, the refuge staffs are minimalist. I got one biologist who runs all of this. And so when the forester came to call and said, okay, it's time to do your forest inventory, he tapped 2 of his interns to go take the data. He knew that I liked forestry, so he asked me to go if I wanted to go with him. And sure, any excuse to run around in the woods, I'll take it. So that's how I got involved. Now, as far as what a forest inventory is and what it does, it was originally done as a commercial tool to analyze just the amount and the value of the marketable timber that you had in your stand. So in other words, how is your forest stocked? If it's optimally stocked, you're going to have enough trees per acre, and the trees themselves are going to be large enough that you're going to get a good return out of the tree when you harvest it. There is such a thing as being overstocked, which is to say that you've got a few too many trees and the trees themselves are not as large as you'd like them. So you're on the diminishing return side of any kind of return that you get out of it. Now, it didn't take long for folks to realize that you could take an awful lot of other data while you were looking at these individual trees. You could look at the biological integrity of the woods. How was it doing? Was it regenerating okay? Was the soil replenishing okay? What were the trends going on in there? Are you regenerating the same species? Are you cycling to a different kind of forest? And all like that. So there was very definitely a conservation purpose that came into this early on. Now, in the United States, the Forest Service that works under the Department of Agriculture does most of the work. They manage the national forests and national grasslands, and they do assist visits really with the states, the cooperative extensions, and the private landowners. The United States is among the top 5 countries in the world as far as exporting forest products. And what we export are usually the raw logs and the lumber. They're not really finished stuff. Also, about half of the forest inventory is privately held. So there's a real role there for the Forest Service to get in and try to bring some standardization and some expert assistance to the folks that are on the forest plot, so they can manage it. Now, with us, the Fish and Wildlife Service works for interior. We're more concerned with managing for conservation purposes, because we want to take care of the waterfowl and all the other critters that interact with the waterfowl over our refuges. So we're more interested in the woods being more natural and being something that's going to support the habitats that all these critters live in. So the Forest Service, in their role as the resident experts, worked with us to develop a simplified protocol, one that could be done quickly, and the one that was focused a little bit more toward conservation as opposed to commercial purposes. And that's what I'm going to go through with you folks tonight. Now, that's the what and the why. As far as the how, if you've done data collection work at all, and I think most of you have, you will know that you don't look at the whole woods. If we were doing that, we'd still be out there. So you want to establish plots where you can take enough data to extrapolate what the forest looks like. They've got to be dispersed enough to not skew the data, and they've got to be enough of them so that you get an accurate picture of what's going on. We didn't have to worry about that. Our plots are already set. They've been set several years ago, GPS tagged, put on the electronic devices we took in the field with us. So all we had to do was navigate out there. Good thing, because we had to do it by canoe, or we had to slog through the underbrush with a map and a compass. And if we hadn't had the GPS tags, it would have been a real, it would have been interesting trying to be sure we were at the plots that they wanted us to take the measurements there. Now, once we get out there, though, you also have to know what kind of metrics are you going to take. So I give you the 5 metrics that we used. The first one is the metric that was the reason for the forest inventory in the first place, and that is the tally tree variables. These are individual trees. They would be the money trees. They'd be the ones you want to harvest. But you're going to look at these, and you're going to take most of your data off of these so-called tally trees. Now, the other 4 metrics are more at how's the forest as a whole doing, and can you expect these your harvest of tally trees or growth of the tally trees, in our case, to be sustainable. Now, I'm going to go through each one of these metrics with you tonight. As we go through, they have one common element, and that is the plot center. As far as the footprint for each of these metrics is concerned, though, aside from that center of the plot, they're all different. They all have the different sizes, different types, and we'll go through those. Okay, so we have our forester coming from the region, and 2 interns and a volunteer are going to go with them into the woods. The first thing we had to do is get some training. We did about 3 days worth of schooling, 2 in the classroom, 1 in the field. We concentrated on species identification and really concentrated on the herbs and the forbs and some of the shrubs, because when you get into how is the forest growing, you're going to look at some of the forest layers and some of the growth habits that come in there, and you've got to be able to tell what species it is, or at least pretty close. we also had to go over data collection techniques. They wanted us to do it electronically, but our forester was an old timer. And when he found out that the three of us had no experience with this, he said, we're going to do it with paper. And it's just as well we did, because it's a lot easier to spread the paper out and work with it to see if you've done it right. We also had to learn some terminology, and I'm going to go through some of the terms that are going to come up in this presentation. Basal area is one you might not have heard of very much, but it basically is the measures, it's a summation of the cross sections of the trunks, and it's expressed in square feet per acre. So if you take the diameter of a tree trunk, calculate the area that cross section of the trunk would be, add them all up for all the trees that you're looking at in square feet, that is your basal area. The basal area factor is simply a multiplier, and it has to do with the strength of the wedge prism that we use to select our individual tally trees. And we'll cover that next slide. I don't want to get any further right now. A chain is a common unit of measurement in forestry that is about 66 feet. And we thought it was arbitrary as all get out until the forester told us that no, 10 square chains equals an acre. So that's why it's 66 feet. A log in forestry parlance is a marketable section of tree trunk that is 16 feet long. If the diameter is big enough, we call it a saw log, and that's what your 2x4s and 8x10s and all that come out of. If it's a smaller diameter, the upper part of the trunk usually is considered a pulp log, because that's not big enough to really get any marketable lumber out of it. You're just going to consign it to the paper mill. When we take the diameter of a tree, we take it at breast height, so it's DBH, and it's canonically 4.5 feet or 1.3 meters off the ground. And you do that for two reasons. One, it's easy to take, it's right in front of you. And the second is that you avoid skewing the data by dodging the flare that the trunk will show at the base. And especially in areas that are wet, a tree is going to flare out considerably. And that's one of the indicators that you have a wetland or a very high water table, is you see that flare above ground. All right, as far as the measurements themselves, the tools we used, there are a lot of them that are in the trade, and a lot of them are dirt simple. Some of them you can even fabricate in the field if you're using simple comparison methods of measurement. The trouble is the data you get out of them is rough. It's not wholly accurate. So the tools that the forester wanted us to use are the ones I showed you here. The wedge prism, and we'll deal with that here next slide. The clinometer is the second one. Now that we use to take the height of the tree, and there's some tricks to that. And the third is the diameter tape, which is down there at the bottom. Now, if you look at that tape segment, you'll see it's got two scales on it. And you'll see that the top scale is inches, just linear inches, like you'd read off a ruler. The bottom scale is also in inches, but it's an inch multiplied by pi. So if you put the tape around the tree as if you're taking the circumference, you read that lower scale, you're reading the diameter directly. All right, I mentioned that the only common point in all these footprints for these different metrics is the plot center. And if we were to nest them all, this is what it would look like. And this is what our plot designs look like. This is what we would try to replicate in the field. Now, you see these wedgy things coming out from the center that are going around and to various tree trunks out there. This is what's called a variable radius plot, and this is how we select the trees, the individual tally trees that we're going to look at. And we'll go into the reasons of that here in a couple minutes. As for the rest of the footprints, we've got 3 fixed radius plots represented by the 3 circles here. And then the final one we do using a set of transects that are set at right angles. Now, as we go through, I'm going to have a little thumbnail up in the upper right-hand corner, which shows the particular footprint we're looking at that'll be highlighted in green, but it's going to be a very small thumbnail of this sketch, as you see. So we're out at our plot. Which trees do we survey? We got to pick our tally trees first because that's where we're going to take most of our data. But can we do it on a fixed radius, or do we have to use the variable radius? The variable radius can be tough to get your head around, and we had trouble with it. And when we tried to get more information out of the forester, he just laughed at us and said, "Trust the force, it works." And what I'm going to do is try to explain why, because I think now I'm beginning to understand why. But you see over here on the left, you've got two plots set up, and these are basically the same plot of woodland. You see the trees are the same size in the same place. So on the upper picture, we've got a fixed radius plot. You're going to draw a circle that's 1/10 of an acre, and you're going to look at all, and you're going to take data on every tree that's inside that circle. Well, that's fine. I mean, that'll get you a representative look. But you see that you're missing some of the larger trees in this plot. And you're not getting very much coverage over the plot as a whole. So kind of raises the question of whether your data is going to be truly representative. When we drop down here to a variable radius plot, you see that we're taking the larger trees and we're getting them spread a little bit more over the whole plot itself. Now, the trick with a variable radius, if you look up here at the thumbnail, you can see that those green wedges are in place. That's a common angle. There's the same angle for each wedge. So of course, the further away from the center it goes, the greater the length that arc is going to be. And how that works as far as picking your trees is concerned, the larger the tree is, the further away from the center it can be and still be counted. That allows you to get the bigger trees. All right. Now, how do we pick the angle and how do we measure all that? Well, that's where the prism comes in. What the prism does is it offsets the image a little bit. It's ground to a certain certain set of parameters, which is way in the weeds in optics, and I didn't get into. But suffice to say that for this particular wedge prism, it's got a little, you see a little 10 on it. That's a 10 basal area factor. It's written as a 10 BAF prism. The 10 is the strength that we use on the East Coast. If you were on the West Coast where the forests are different, they're much larger trees, a little farther apart, you would use a smaller factor. And I'll demonstrate what that factor is used for here in a few minutes. But we use the default of the 10 strength, the 10 BAF prism. Once you start with that, with any given strength of a prism, you got to stay with it for all of the data. Otherwise, you're going to get basically two different data sets. All right, so as we look through, we're going to displace the image. And as you see here in this quad chart here, the first sketch over on the left, you see the image is displaced a little. It's not completely away from the rest of the trunk, it's just displaced a little. What that means is that the tree itself is large enough that it completely fills, that it completely covers that length of arc. The diameter of the tree is greater than the length of arc that's encompassed by that angle at the distance where the tree is growing. So again, the larger the tree, the farther it can be from the center point. So that tree is in, we count that one. In the middle sketch, you see a tree that's right on the edge, that the tree's diameter then is equal to the length of arc described by that angle. And just because it's on the edge and you're not going to be sure whether it's in or out, rather than waste a whole lot of time trying to measure it more precisely, you just count every other tree. For the sketch on the far right, where the image is displaced completely away from the rest of the trunk, that tree is too small. And so we ignore it for this part of the inventory. Okay, we're at the plot, we got our survey trees. Now we start taking the variables on them. Again, we're still on our variable radius plot here, as you can see from the thumbnail. First thing we do is we have that prism, we started at looking north and we go all the way around, we've picked our trees. And as we do that, we're going to ascertain the status. Is it alive? Is it dying? Is it dead? And the species. Now, species can be tricky. You know, we had a lot of ash in our woods up there. In fact, ash is one of the dominant hardwoods. But was it a green ash or a black ash? Both of them like having their feet wet. Both of them are swamp things. But given that we'd had the ash borer go through there a few years ago, and we've had a lot of damage, and it would have been nice to be able to ascertain whether the green ash was more susceptible or the black ash was more susceptible. And if you can't tell the difference, you're not going to be able to record that. It's a good job we had the forester with us, because that otherwise we'd have been there with the field guides forever trying to figure it out. At any rate, once you ascertain the species and whether it's alive, dead, or dying, then we start taking the actual measurements. We take the diameter, that's diameter, breast height, 4.5 feet off the ground. And the sketch I have over on the right shows you how that's done. For a straight up tree on level ground, it's 4.5 feet off the ground, take the diameter. Multi-trunk tree, you're going to do both trunks. For a tree like a silver maple that branches low, you do it below the lowest branch. And then you note that you've taken it not as far up as you should. And there are similar tricks for taking a tree that's leaning and a tree that's on a slope. Now for taking the height of a tree, this is where you have to practice with the clinometer a little bit. And that can be a little tricky sometimes. Basically, you're going to take, you're going to try to figure out the angles and get the heights from two triangles. You're going to take this triangle that is between you, the tree, and the top, and then you, the tree, and the base of the tree, the blue one and the red one. And you're going to combine those heights. The way you do that with the clinometer is you first pace off about, or measure off, if the woods is open enough to do this, one chain, 66 feet. And when you look through the clinometer, you're going to see two scales. One of the scales measures the height in feet at 66 feet of the distance. So if you can do this from a chain away, you can read the height directly. And what you do is you level the clinometer so that the scale is showing 0. That sets your eye line. And then you look up to get the top, and you have to be sure you can see the top. And then you got to look down to get the bottom, and be sure you can see the bottom. And then take those two values, add them together. Now that's if you've got a straight tree on a level ground. If you're downslope of a tree, it's conceivable that you might not be adding these two. You might be subtracting one from the other just to get the right height. But you've got to do both triangles. Okay, now if you can't do it from a chain, there's a second scale on there that measures the angle as a percentage of that quarter circle from 0 degrees elevation to 90 degrees elevation. So if you're 100 feet away, you measure a 40-degree angle. That's your H1 here is 40 feet. If you're 50 feet away and you measure 40-degree angle, H1 is 20 feet. It's just similar triangles. And once you've done this a couple times, it gets to be fairly easy. But again, the important point is you got to do both triangles if you're going to take the height, because the clinometer will only work if you can start it with that with a level baseline, which is your eye line to the tree. Okay, there are other tally tree variables that we do. Crown placement and condition is quite important, actually, because crowns are one of the main indicators of a tree's health. So you want to take a good look at that. Now, if any of you have looked at a wood line from across a field, you will notice that there's a definite top to the canopy of the forest, and there's an occasional tree that pokes up above it. Those trees that poke up above it are what we call super canopy. That's the crown of that tree is completely above the canopy. It's going to get sun all over it. A dominant tree is in the canopy, but it gets sun on the top and the sides of the crown. A co-dominant tree gets sun on just the top of the crown. An overtop tree is one that's in the upper understory. It hasn't punched all the way through yet. Okay, once you've got the placement down, now you look at the condition. Is it a healthy crown? Is it vigorous, which tells you the tree's doing fine? Or do we have a little bit of dieback or a lot of dieback, or is it dead or dying? And what that begins to tell you is we may have some site issues with it. The site may be drying out, so a tree that likes moisture, like a cottonwood or a green ash, may not do so well. Or you may have had a lot of insect damage. You may have a borer or something in there. You may have a disease process going on, or you just might have suffered a hailstorm. But that's kind of what the crown data here begins to tell you. Now, cavities and wildlife value I've lumped together because for our purposes at the refuge, we like cavities. They do good things. They're nesting sites. They really help the wildlife out. If this were a commercial survey, the cavities would be a bad thing, because they will impact the amount of marketable timber you can get out of there. Now, other indicators of wildlife value, you want to look at the bark. Is it going to encourage small birds or bats to hang there? Is it something that vines can grow up so the tree could support those? Are the branches set up in such a way that an animal can climb up easily? We have fishers out at, fisher cats, the relative of the otter out at the refuge. They're beginning to come back there. So occasionally we see them get up in the trees. Occasionally bears will also use certain trees as marker posts. They'll either scent mark it or scratch on it or whatever. We don't see much of that. We don't really get bears at the refuge. We get a transient occasionally, but we don't have any residents. Finally, we look to see what kind of forest products you could get out of these trees. Remember, these are the 8 to 10 tally trees that you've picked in that plot using your wedge prism. Okay. You're going to divide this into saw logs and pulp logs. The saw log is a 16-foot length, right, at 12 inches diameter or better. A pulp log is a 16-foot length, between 6 and 12 inches in diameter. And when we record them in half logs. So a 24-foot section of tree trunk would be 1.5 logs. That's how we record it. Now, one of the other things that we do when we pick these tally trees, I've mentioned the thing about a basal area factor that goes into how those prisms are ground. The basal area factor is simply a multiplier. And to calculate it very quickly for the plot you're on, you take the number of trees that you've identified using that prism. In this case, in this thumbnail, we've got 7 of them. Optimally, you want to be between 8 and 12. So we've got 7 of them here. You would take that 7, multiply it by the 10, and you get a 70 square feet per acre basal area. That's all that basal area factor is. It's a multiplier. And when we're a different kind of forest, like the big, huge spruce forest you get out west, you'd use a different prism for that. All right. Second metric, and you see we've changed our thumbnail up there. This is the smallest of the fixed radius plots, is regeneration. And here what we're looking for is understory composition and see if we can get a prediction of what the future stand is going to look like. So if we're going to get the same trees or we're going to get different ones. And what we do here, we have a set series of parameters for seedlings and saplings. And anything that matches those parameters, within that plot, we count it and we list it out by species. We then assess the browse level with, as most of us, I think, have done. You look for crop stems, you look for strip leaves, you look for lack of a shrub layer. The photograph I have down here is not the best, but it gives you an idea. Outside of the deer exclosure here, you've got nothing coming up. Absolutely nothing. It's been browsed to where there's really very little left. Inside the enclosure, you've got what looks like a pretty healthy shrub layer and a pretty healthy understory. So you've got some young saplings coming up there. Over here, outside the exclosure, you don't have much. Now, for us, we had a lot of dead ash, and some of you may have a question, if a tree's dead, do you count it as a tally tree? If it's big enough, yes, you do. And the reason you do that is because you want to see what's going on with the canopies of those tally trees. And if you've got some tally trees that are dying off, like the ash were, you want to know that because the data is going to reflect that the sun's coming down further into the woods. The canopy is going to be lower, and you should see something in the regeneration there. That's going to tell you whether you're going to get a regenerated ash wood or you're going to transition to something else. Well, for what we found was that we had a lot of green ash coming. An awful lot of green ash was coming back. Now, whether it'll survive the deer browse and whether it will attract another wave of ash borer when it gets big enough, that remains to be seen. But it was interesting to us that even with the depredations the ash borer has done, we were getting an awful lot of regeneration of it. All right, the third metric that we do is what's called coarse woody debris. This is one of several soil parameters that you could measure to figure out how your soil is regenerating and how is it doing. Are we taking the nitrogen and the carbon and recycling it the way it's supposed to be, so that to support the continued growth of the living trees there? So why do we just take coarse woody debris? It's easy. And the way we do it is we run out two transects. We run out at 90-degree angles. At the first plot, you do it north and east. Second plot, east and south. Third plot, south and west. Fourth plot, west and north. Fifth plot, start over and just keep going around. Now, what you do with these transects, you run them out to 24 feet, and anytime the transect intersects a piece of debris that's large enough, and that's when it intersects the branch has to be 5 inches in diameter. You count that. You can count the same branch several times. If one branch is lying across two transects, you count it twice. But you count every intersection. Now, if I were to take a transect and run it up, just right up the middle of this photograph here, you see this big downed log in the foreground. We'd intercept it twice. The first one, the lower branch, we would take the diameter at the intersection. We would take the diameter at the small end, the diameter at the large end, which would be where we're toppled over, and then the length. Now, if we continue the transect, we'd hit it again here at this branching piece of it. Here again, we would take the measurements at the intersection, the small end, which is the end of the branch, and the large end, which would be the join with the main trunk. And then we take the length. So you would count parts of this branch twice. And that is how we do coarse woody debris. Okay, I have somebody requesting remote control on my screen. Here, so I'm going to.
You should probably ignore that.
Okay, that works for me.
Mhm.
But I've got no cursor here, so I'm not sure I can get rid of this thing. Anyway. Let me, Chrissy, is this showing up? Is this little request showing up?
No, I don't see it on my screen.
Okay, then I'm going to go ahead then.
Okay.
With the vegetation profile, that's the fourth of the 5 metrics that we're using, and that is a little tricky to do. What that's supposed to do is provide information on the habitat, biological diversity, and so on. But what you're doing is measuring the vegetation type and density, both vertically and horizontally across the plot. So you all are familiar with forest layers. You know, you've got canopy, understory, shrub, herb, and forest floor. What we're doing here, we've got different layers that we're looking at for the physical structure of the vegetation profile as well. But we want to to look at what kind of growth habit do we have. So in the tree layer, we're looking at the trees, which are the single trunk with a crown. Shrub layer looks at multiple woody trunks coming up from the ground with a crown to it. The forb layer is the non-woody herbal. So you get ferns and a lot of your annuals in there. And then the graminoids, of course, are the grasses, sedges, and rushes. So what we want to do is, having identified those growth habits and what in some of the plants there at the plot that occupy those growth habits, we want to look at where they are, and we want to estimate the amount of canopy coverage. Now, by canopy coverage, I'm talking about sunlight actually hitting the leaf. That is provided by each growth habit. So for the trees, we're looking at the trees and both the core trees and the understory trees, the big canopy trees, the understory trees. You're looking at how much canopy coverage does that growth habit provide? And you look at it in the tree layer, you look at it in the shrub layer, so you catch your younger ones. You might have one or two down in the forb or herb layer. Probably not going to have many way down at the bottom with the sun actually on it. Okay, then you do the same thing for the shrubs in each of the 4 layers, for the forbs in each of the 4 layers, and for the graminoids in each of the 4 layers. Now, obviously, you're going to get a lot of zeros in there. You know, you're not going to have many graminoids up out of that bottom layer, let alone up into the above 16 feet. But what that does for you, it gives you an idea of where the actual canopy resides. Now, in a healthy forest, you would expect it to be fairly high, but when in ours, we would see it actually come down a little bit lower because we had so much dead ash in there. We've got so much of the canopy, the high canopy, had been devastated by the ash borer. Now, finally, what you do with this physical structure one is you mentally collapse the canopy into a 2-dimensional plane. The best way to visualize doing this is pretend you're looking at an aerial photograph from the top. And how much of each growth habit, the tree growth habit, the shrub growth habit, the forb growth habit, and so on, are providing actual canopy coverage. What is the percentage of that? And that's kind of a check on what you've done before with identifying how many, which growth habit is in which layer and which is providing the coverage. All right, having done that, once you get that down, now we get to do it again with a species matrix. And so instead of a core and understory growth habit, we're looking at big trees and little trees. The other growth habits remain the same. The layers remain the same. And what you want to do is identify up to 4 species that provide 3% or more. So how do we measure 3%? Well, the trick they taught us was, we did the arithmetic before we went out in the field. But the trick they taught us was for a 24-foot radius, a 3-foot radius is about 4 feet. A 3% radius is about 4 feet. So you figure opposite shoulder to the end of the arm is a pretty good estimation. And if you can do this and you can see where it is, you can kind of picture a 3% circle of that 24-foot plot or 24-foot radius plot and be able to tell what kind of species is doing what. Now, in several plots, we came in with sunlight coming all the way to the ground in some spots. And we had a beautiful little oak tree or beech tree growing by itself, taking up 1% of the ground, if that. And it looked like it was going to survive. The deer browse was up high enough where it was going to do that, and looked like it was going to come on and do. And we didn't count it because it wasn't that 3%. It was all by its lonesome. So you had those 2 parameters there for up to 4 species that provide 3% or more of the aerial canopy. Now, for each of those species, then you record the coverage and the layer in which the majority of the coverage exists. The last bullet there I put in because I can tell you from being out there doing this, especially during the afternoon plots, you get tired, you get hot, you fight mosquitoes, you slog through multifloral rows to get out to these plots. And when it comes time to do these layers, you just want to do the layer cake and go home. And it's easy to try to just look at it and eyeball it. And if you're going to make a mistake, this is where you do it. Okay, the last metric we have is the combined plot. And this is more of a global look over the entire area that you've been studying or taking the data on. And here we're looking at bigger picture kind of things. Before we go out, we've identified a species watch list, and this is peculiar to your refuge or your site. Are you going to look for threatened and endangered species or rare species? You might. You're going to look for site indicators, like is it wet, is it dry, are you having a green ash or a cottonwood that tells you you've got a high water table there, or a willow, or successional indicators like a series of quaking aspen coming on or baby cottonwood coming on, since they're colonizers. What we looked for was largely invasives, and it wasn't a question of were they there, it was a question of how many of them. I slogged through more bush honeysuckle and multifloral rose than I care to remember. Second thing we look for is damage. Is there, what kind of damage and what's the severity of it? So do we have an insect problem? Do we have a disease problem? Do we have a storm damage issue going on? And that's basically the extent to it. You just want to assess, is there any overarching issue going on out there? You know, we spend a lot of time on canopy, but here you're looking at the upper canopy, and you're looking for to the extent to which it's closed. So if it's more than 70% coverage, it's considered closed. Between 30 and 70% coverage is considered moderately open. You're going to do this by a percentage. And with all the dead ash we had, we expected that. We were down to around the 50-60% coverage in most places. If you're less than 30% coverage, you've got an open canopy, and that tells you one of two things. It either tells you that you're cycling into some other kind of habitat, either a marsh or a savanna, or it tells you that you've had an awful lot of damage going on with the canopy trees, and you should see a lot of dead trunks around. The final thing you look at is general site conditions. So that's soil type. Is it a hydric soil? Is it a dry soil? Is it rocky? Is it loamy? Is it mucky? Is it clay? And where are we in the basic geology? Are we on a ridge? Are we on a slope? Are we in a defile? Are we next to a cliff? Are we on level ground? That tells us a lot about how the plants are going to do in that particular site. Now, once all this data is taken, we've done our 5 metrics there. We've got all the stuff written down. What we would do was either in the field or back at the office that afternoon, we'd go through it while it was still fresh and see if there were any inconsistencies that would jump out at us. If we could resolve it just by memory, we would do that. Sometimes we had to go out the next morning and take another look at the plot to be sure we were getting it right. Then that data is packaged up. It's sent to the region, which resides somewhere in Massachusetts, and their analysts go through it in a lot deeper detail. And what they're looking for is anomalies. They're looking for, basically, does the data transition from one spot to another? Is the data what we're expecting? Is the data consistent? So if we're showing a lot of damage this year from the ash borer, we should be seeing that pretty much across the woods wherever we have tally trees that are largely ash trees. And if we have a couple plots in there that don't show that, or that show, say, don't show any canopy degradation, but we've got, indications that there was ash borer damage. That's an inconsistency that doesn't match up. And when the analysts see that, they'll kick it back to us. And they'll say, you go out, take another look at that plot. We're not sure you did that quite right. And we go back out. We had 2 or 3 of those. Yeah, out of about 50 plots, we had a few come back, and we'd have to go out and look at them again. And that is all I've got for you. So picture I've got here is another deer exclosure. On the left is the healthy understory, and shrub layer on the right is something that's been browsed. You can see it looks like somebody's just burrowed a tunnel through there. Any rate, what I have done for you guys, I have put my email address in the chat box, and that will, if you're interested in the references that I've used, I've included those as well. And I can send those to you. So if you're interested in seeing those, shoot me an email and I'll get that out to you. At this point, I will entertain questions. No guarantee I can answer them, but if I can't, I'll take a pass and try to get an answer and get it out to you. So with that, Christy, it's back to you.
Great, thanks so much, Dave. That was excellent, excellent walkthrough. And I especially loved your slide of the prism and the view of each of the 3 trees through the prism. That was very clever. It was very illustrative. So Colette asks, grapevines in the woods, what are the pros and cons?
Well, grapevines are, I think, may be somewhat parasitical. I don't know whether they are or not. Generally, we regard that as more or less beneficial because it provides some habitats for birds and so on that would eat on the grapes. It would provide a way for that vine to climb. Now, the vine may have a detrimental effect on a tree if the tree is too young, because the vine can, of course, shade it out. But overall, I think we don't dislike that.
Okay, Lori is raising her hand. Lori, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
It's actually Dave.
Sure.
Oh, it's Dave. Dave, using Lori's name.
Yeah, now that we have more modern technology, rather than just a written report or a digital report, is there any kind of accompanying photography or video that gets filed with these things?
There could be. Certainly, we were in a position to take video, but the only observation I would make that in high summer was when you do this, because you want the plants to be in leaf because you want to have as many species clues as you can. If you're in any kind of a healthy forest, it's going to be hard to get a video of anything except a bunch of trees and leaves. As you can see from the pictures I had of the deer exclosure, it was, you have to know what you're looking for to see that. Also, I'm not sure really that a lot of these data points really are amenable to video documentation. Crown condition might be, if you could get a good shot of the crown of these trees when you're doing your tally trees, you might be able to get a good feel for what's a really lush, healthy crown and what's been damaged. And from somebody who's been in forestry for a long time, might be able to look at a video of that and tell me, okay, this looks like an ash tree, and yeah, this crown is consistent with ash borer damage. Look for this kind of borehole, this kind of, if you want to take a scraping of the bark, see if you get that characteristic gallery, up and down gallery signature in the phloem. The thing is, when we had a forester on site with us though, and what he did for us on a couple of these ash trees, he would say, yeah, let's get that roofing shingle saw there and go through and see if we can identify that gallery. We found a couple.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Selma asks, are ash seedlings growing under the dead ones or are different species moving in?
We saw a lot of, we had mostly green ash in our woods that were victims of the ash borer, and most of the regeneration that we saw coming on was green ash. Now, some of it was sucker growth off the bottom, and that's typical of a tree that's been hit with the ash borer. They'll try to regenerate from down below. But we did see an awful lot of just seedlings. And again, it was largely green ash. So it's pretty clear to me that there was a heavy seed set, and that those seeds are coming on. Now, whether they'll stay coming on, I think is an open question. Every plot we were on, we saw some deer browse, some more than others, but there was deer browse associated with it. Kind of hard not to get if there's so many of them. And we don't know whether the ash borer is going to make a return appearance when those trees get big enough where the borers are going to want to start drilling holes and laying their eggs.
Okay, thank you. Dave, I was wondering, were there many plots where you were getting advanced regeneration, where the seedlings were actually making it to a height taller than 5 feet?
There might have been a couple of spots where that happened. We had 1 or 2 plots that were almost completely green ash, and there were a few individual trees in there that had somehow escaped the borer. Yeah, we flagged those to the biologist. I figured he'd want to know. But we maybe saw a few trees that had gotten up into that high shrub layer there, but not many, because the borer's been through fairly recently, so we're only talking maybe 2 or 3 years.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's see, Alice asked, she said, how well does sucker growth succeed in becoming actual trees?
Not very often, at least with the ash. That doesn't happen very often. Generally, it would depend on, I guess it would depend on the species of the tree and what kind of conditions it was growing in. If something's hurt the parent tree enough to create a lot of sucker growth coming on, there's something going on. Now, if it's transient, like storm damage, your sucker growth may be able to overcome it. Otherwise, I'd say no. The sucker growth is an attempt at the tree to fight it off, and it's generally considered one of the last gasps that the tree makes before it finally succumbs.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? Alice did have a follow-up to that, Dave. She was asking, she said she was always taught to remove suckers, but from dead trees, should the suckers be removed?
From dead trees out in the woods, I'd let them go. I mean, what do you got to lose?
Yeah.
But otherwise, yes. If you're trying to grow a specimen tree or trying to grow something in your yard for landscaping, or if you're just worried about the health of a tree, you do want to prune the suckers off, because it saps growth from the leader of the tree.
Okay.
In fact, when I was a very young man, my father took me in hand and taught me how to prune. And one of the things he would always do would be to get that sucker growth off, so that it wouldn't take strength from the tree itself. He'd also want to prune out any intercrossing branches or anything like that that would that might rub together and perhaps weaken the tree.
Okay, thank you. Tracy had asked, why not use a thumb rule and a Biltmore stick?
Biltmore stick is one of the very basic forestry tools, and the forester did show us how to use it, and then told us that we'd be better off using the inclinometer, because he thought it got you a little bit better data, a little bit more accurate. Now, I think that may be open to discussion, actually, because what I've heard from the Biltmore stick is it can be very accurate if you know how to use it.
Okay.